Hey guys, welcome to week 5 of our series, The New Normal. We have been having an awesome time just diving into the book of Ephesians, studying this letter written by Paul. As you see in the first 3 weeks of our series, we talked about the first 3 chapters. And here Paul writes once again, he talks about the gospel and talks about how we find salvation through Jesus Christ. And now for the last 3 chapters, chapters 4 through 6, we talk about, last week, what it means to live out your faith. Last week, we talked about the words and the power your words have and, just watching the way we speak. And this week, we're going to keep talking about words, but also our words and our actions. So for chapter 5 this week, the title is Words and Actions That Reflect Jesus. See, when I think about words and actions that reflect Jesus, I think about, characteristics and living out the love that Jesus has for us. It reminds me growing up, a lot of people on staff make fun of me for this, but the mannerisms I learned, through my parents and my grandparents. Like, for example, I always like to raise my hand before I speak because I was always told, you can't interrupt people like that, And oftentimes I see my parents doing that, whether they're in church or in a meeting, they always raise their hand. Or there's sometimes, instead of saying, when someone tells me, have a good day, I never say you too. I always say you as well. Because growing up, my grandma would always tell me, you always have to say you as well. Because in Spanish, you can't say y tú. That's not proper. You have to say y usted. So every time I said y tú, I got in trouble. So for me growing up, mannerisms was such a big thing. And through those manners actually reflected, the things my parents taught me was to always be respectful and to be kind to one another and to never be rude. So with that, same thing Paul writes here in chapter 5 in the first 2 verses. And it says, watch what God does. Then you do it like children who learn proper behavior from their parents. Mostly what God does is love you. Keep company with him and learn a life of love. Observe how Christ loved us. His love was not cautious, but extravagant. He didn't love in order to get something from us, but to give everything of himself to us. Love like that. Once again, this previous week, we talked about our words and, the power our words have. But this week, once again, we talk about reflecting God's love in our actions. As we see this big vocabulary word in this verse, extravagant. See, when I first read this verse, a long time ago, and I was first, became a Christian, I looked at the word extravagant. I'm like, that's a cool word. What does that mean? So I researched it and everything for you guys, and I'm gonna read what all the theologians of the world say and all the big vocab stuff. And it says, the love of Jesus is an extravagant love. It is beyond our comprehension, but it is understandable. And God's love does capture our hearts, stirs our souls, renews our minds, and directs our way. God is clear, of course, that Jesus is the embodiment of true love, and it is only through Jesus that we receive and experience the reality of what love is. Only through Jesus that we can receive the extravagant love of God that can fully capture our hearts. Extravagant love is a love without condition. See, when I think about extravagant love, I often think about my parents in the way, me growing up with them. I know there was times where, as kids, there was times, I disrespected my parents. I didn't behave well. I didn't listen to them. But instead of my parents just holding that pettiness and stop loving me, they still loved me regardless. So when there was times growing up as a kid when I told my dad, I don't like when you put me to sleep. I like when mommy does it more, My dad still loved me, but he was still hurt in that moment. But once again, he continued to love me. Or there was times when I was in 6th grade and I got in trouble at school. Instead of my mom saying, go walk home now, that's your punishment, she'll pick me up, The extravagant love, a good example once again, is like the love my parents had for me, without condition. And they never stopped loving me or they just, put me away. No, they continue to love me regardless of how much hurt I caused to them. They continue to love me. And they didn't ask for anything back. They didn't do all that, just like the way Jesus did with us. He came and died on the cross for our sins without condition. He didn't die for a select few. He died for all. And that's one thing I want to just remind us all this week, that Jesus came and died for our sins without condition. And we reflect that throughout our week. You're asking, Matthew, how do you reflect that throughout the week? But for an example, this next week, if you go somewhere, open the door for someone. Or if you go eat at a restaurant with your family, maybe Sunday after service, thank the waiter. Be nice to them. And those actions, you really do reflect the love of Jesus. And once again, I want to encourage you guys to take those action steps this next week.